Much to my amazement, Ileana knew who I was in the interview. I was kind of a nobody. She actually knew who I was because she was a philosophy teacher at North Carolina, University of North Carolina, Asheville. And she was using I do other stuff than Moog. I wrote a book called The Goal and What You Should Know About Science. And she was using this book in her class. And it was kind of a strange connection. So Ileana has taught at the University of North Carolina, Asheville. I looked online, and there's actually an oral history interview with Ileana about her experiences teaching philosophy there. And I'm now introducing her here as Bob's widow, who is going to say a word or two about Bob and the archive. So welcome, Ileana.
Thank you. I'm very glad to be here, and I'm especially glad because for over 20 years I haven't been well enough to go to this kind of event. So if there's one I didn't want to miss, it's this one, and I'm better now. So I'm especially happy to have come here and seen what a wonderful treatment the archives that I donated of Bob's have gotten here. And I want to say a thank you to Catherine Reagan, who was a delight to work with, to Trevor, who did, I think, a wonderful job of putting the captions on the exhibit, and to everyone who contributed to what I think is a really, really fine exhibit. It was a pleasure to see it. I wanted to say that I'm really convinced that this is the best home for Bob's Archives, not only because of the remarkably good handling that material of this kind gets here, and not only because of the fact that this is where he got his PhD in applied physics, but also because of the fact that he genuinely was happy at Cornell and was happy in Trumansburg, and this is really the area in which the beginning of his inventiveness and his career as an inventor, except for building theremins with his dad, this is where it got started. So this is a really appropriate place, and I feel he would be very satisfied. Everyone who knows Bob, I think, will agree with me when I say that he was an extraordinarily fine human being, a really good person, a delight to be around, very funny, as well as being multiply talented in almost everything that had to do with using your hands. He was also an extremely modest person. But as someone who was very interested in the history of electronic music and who was also a remarkably fine teacher and lecturer, I was able to hear him speak a number of times, and he was always great. He was very well aware that he was part of the history of electronic music, and as a result, he kept good records, and I was able to turn over to Cornell, I think, a significant addition to that history. So I know that this will be a place where a lot of people will be able to come, and I'm hoping that others will contribute to those archives to round out the story. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the way in which Bob might have been happiest to see the archives used. As the modest person he was, I don't think he would have had any objection to people researching his life, and I'm sure lots of people will be doing that. But I think that his greatest interest was in inventiveness. He modeled himself very consciously on Leon Theremin, who exemplified an ability to use usual things in unusual ways, and whose inventions showed a very high degree of what mathematicians call elegance. the ability to make something very effective and very powerful out of extremely simple materials. And like a lot of people, Bob not only modeled himself consciously on someone he admired, but I think he often felt a little uncertain about how good a job he was doing. I remember his telling me that he had planned, as so many engineers did, to get a job at Bell Labs. But he was never sure that if he had gotten a job at Bell Labs, he would have done very well, because he had a tendency to use things in unusual ways and to solve problems in odd ways. But that tendency, which was probably not ideal if you were going to be a Bell Labs engineer, was what I think, and I think many people would agree, made him the kind of inventor he was. And I think that what he would be looking for in people who come here to research, what he would be especially interested in, would be people who are themselves looking for inspiration in finding out how he did what he did. And that may be the most valuable contribution that the archives can make. I'd like to finish by showing an artifact, which I'm not donating to the archives, which I think exemplifies Bob's approach to things. I'm a tea drinker, and I drink tea by the pot. And as so often happens, teapot lids tend to fall off and get broken. You pour a little too far and the lid falls off, and so teapot lid had gotten broken, and I said, what will I do now? I love this teapot, and now I can't use it. And Bob said, I'll make you a teapot cover. So he did, and I don't know how easy it is to see, but what he did was he took some material, I'm still not quite sure what it was, and he made a small circle and then a larger one, which he angled twice to make it cover the lid. And then he put a screw through the bottom, and then he used a synthesizer knob on the top as the knob. And I love this. I've used it for many years, and it always gives me pleasure. But I think in many ways it exemplifies what was characteristic of Bob's approach. There was a problem that needed to be solved. He used a material that hadn't been originally purposed for this. He did quite a lot of straightforward, but in some ways tricky stuff. And he got exactly the result he needed. But it was a very unconventional approach. And I think that characterizes not only who he was as an inventor, but what he hoped others would do after him. So with that, I will close my statement.
Thank you very much.
I'm betting that when you drop it on the floor, it doesn't break either.
That's true. It's been tested a number of times.
And Ileana's going to stay as a member of the panel as well. So the characteristic of all of the panelists are we're going to delve into Bob's way of working. They've all worked very closely with Bob Moog in different capacities. So on the far left there, I'd like to welcome Steve Dunnington. We saw a picture of him. Brian Kehoe, I think, showed a picture yesterday. You looked a little younger in that. We all looked younger back in the day. And Steve has been working at Moog Music. He's the head of hardware. How many years have you been working there, Steve?
25 years.
25 years. So you were at Big Briar before, presumably?
That's correct. Yes.
Yeah. So he's got, Big Briar was Bob's company before it became Moog Music, when he got the right to use his name again. We also have Mike Adams sitting here, who's the founder of Moog Music and the CEO, maybe still. I don't know whether you're still the CEO, Mike. I think you are, right?
I am the CEO, but I was not the founder.
You were not the founder. Ah,
Bob was the founder.
Bob was the founder. I had you there as a founder as well. Okay, but so Mike Adams has got very deep knowledge with Bob Moog. I remember meeting Mike for the first time when Moog Fest used to be in New York City, at one of those early Moog Fests, and welcome here. And then the last gentleman sitting here next to me, he has an incredibly long Wikipedia entry, because this is Herb Deutsch. And Herb Deutsch in this history is a really important figure because he was with Bob Moog when the synthesizer, the modular synthesizer, was invented. In fact, was the inspiration for the modular Moog synthesizer. So I can read a little bit about him, embarrass him from his Wikipedia, and just a tiny bit. Herbert A. Deutsch, born February 1932, is an American composer, inventor, and educator.
Ask a question. Is this working?
No.
And I thought I switched it on, but
We need an engineer to fix this.
that's why. I thought I switched it on. Well,
Yeah,
it's
on.
fine.
You're like, yeah.
It's absolutely on.
So you can do a counter-narrative to this Wikipedia entry, Herb. So I think you're in agreement so far. You're an American composer, inventor, and educator, currently Professor Emeritus of Electronic Music and Composition at Hofstra University. I've been down to Hofstra visiting Herb, and he's got an amazing studio there. And he's best known, of course, for co-inventing the Moog synthesizer with Bob Moog in 1964. Just a little tiny bit about his early life and education. Herb was born in 1932 in Baldwin, Nassau County, New York. At the age of 4, he first realized he had a musical gift. Through his childhood, he studied music and began composing at a young age. And Deutsch attended the Manhattan School of Music, earning his BA and MA there. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that. There's a long bit about his working with Bob Moog, but we're going to actually get him to tell us in person what that was all about. So you've all collaborated with Bob, and let's start. First of all, I'd like to welcome you all as panelists. Thank you for coming to Cornell. Herb, you first met Bob, as I remember the story,
Yes.
for a gentleman called Walter Sear.
Thank you for giving me his name, but I met Bob. I actually had not met Walter Sear. However, I met his tubas that he designed, which he was relatively well known for. But he went into the world of electronic music mostly as a recording engineer in New York City, and then he worked for Bob Moog working as a business manager for his earliest company. I have told this story numerous times, but I'll cut it short. I had just started teaching at Hofstra, and there was the year 1963, and I had been teaching at Hofstra. That was my third year of being on the faculty. And I was very interested in finding out what was going on in education in the state of New York. So I asked, at that time, the chair of the department, could he give me a semester off to go to the New York State School Music Association's annual convention. And I did, and it was up in Rochester, New York. And at that annual convention, which I remember nothing about what really happened. There was a very good band playing for the convention, but I remember very little that happened, except that the people who had musical instruments or musical things that they wanted to sell and offer to the music education world were given little rooms. And I walked into a little room, and there was one man standing there, and a bunch of theremins, and a few tubas. First of all, a few of you smiled at that, and I think I may have laughed pretty loud when I walked in and saw a room with theremins and tubas. But the man was Bob Moog, a young Bob Moog, and he was there because he had designed theremin kits that you could put together. Now, what makes this even more interesting and complete is that probably 8 or 10 months before that, I had bought a theremin kit. I had read about them, and I bought them, and I called up and did the same thing that probably 100,000 people have done. I said, hello, is Robert Moog there? and I was immediately stopped by his wife, actually, who answered the phone at that time, and she said, Moog. And I've never had a problem with that since. But the thing is that when I told Bob Moog we talked and talked and talked, and I knew that he had designed these theremins and theremin kits, and he told me what else he was doing. But he was doing things like building amplifiers for people, inexpensive amplifiers, and keeping a very small operation going. And I said, have you ever thought about building a synthesizer? I actually did say that. The word synthesizer was already used in Columbia University. And what they called a synthesizer was a huge room full of equipment. And two Columbia composers, Vladimir Ussachevsky and Otto were the composers who were working on it. And they gave actually a concert in New York and made an LP recording. And I was still in college when I heard the recording for the first time, and thought, this is fascinating. What is this all about? And so when I was talking to Bob at the NISMA festival, the first thing I said was, what could you build a synthesizer? I actually asked him that, and he answered, I'm not sure what a synthesizer should be. And we talked about what had been built as a he wanted him to be familiar with the music that had been already done by Ussachevsky and learning in their huge studios at Columbia University, which I heard, and I thought, this is wonderful. I'd love to get into this music in some possible way. And that conversation, it lasted probably 3 hours. No one else went in there and talked about about a theremin. No one walked in to talk about the tubas that were there. I didn't even know, I really didn't know until just now the name of the man who built those tubas. But I told Bob that I was doing a concert in New York City in Greenwich Village. And it was already set up in an artist studio in January of 1964. He said, I will be there. And he drove down to New York. He went to that concert. I presented the concert. The concert was reviewed in the New Yorker magazine. And I believe I think it's February 1964. If you want to look through old New Yorker magazines, you will find a long story talking about this concert. And after the concert, Bob and I and our wives at that time sat in a restaurant. When you're in New York City, downtown, you go to an Italian restaurant, because that's where you are when you're downtown in New York City. Down in what is still referred to as Greenwich Village. And we sat and talked about the idea of producing a new instrument. And I immediately went to my teachers at the university and to the chair of the department at that point and said, this man has done some beautiful things. And he wrote a letter to Hofstra, talking about the possibility of getting together in the summer, talking, in fact, about June of 1964, that we would get together and work on the development of a new musical instrument. And I sent that instrument immediately to Hofstra University. And I know I'm telling a story that's many of you may have already heard, but it's a good story. Hofstra University said, that's really a great idea, and we will give you $200.
Generous.
So they gave me $200. I was married, and I had a 3-year-old daughter. And we lived in the cabin outside of Trumansburg, New York. And that is where Bob and I met for 2 weeks and literally worked out the fundamental concept of what was going to become the Moog synthesizer. I don't want to spend too much time on that because I'd like to talk a little bit about newer instrument ideas. I'm not sure what.
I could put a slide up of you working in Trumansburg there.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Oh, you got that slide.
Yeah, that slide.
That Bob took.
I don't know. There it is. It's in my book.
Oh.
I think it's by, you know that
Yeah.
picture? Yeah.
Yes, sure.
Yeah, Bob
yes,
took it.
yes. So that was June of 1964, and we were talking about the idea of certainly oscillators existed, and what they were existed. The concept of controlling things with a keyboard existed, but what we talked about was things that I knew nothing about: voltage control, modulation, frequency modulation, amplitude modulation. All of these were new words to me. And the other big new word, which became very important in the development of electronic instruments, was I was talking to him in maybe 3 days into the time we were together, and I was playing the keyboard, which turned oscillators on. That's it. You know, when you play the keyboard, it was a pitch of an oscillator. And I said, isn't there some way we could put articulation into this? Music has articulation. And he said, what is that? And this is a really true story. I said, well, I'm a trumpet player. And articulation on a trumpet is when you blow into the horn, you go ta. And that gives you an attack, ta. And if you go ta, that gives you a sustained attack. When you play the piano, when the piano was invented, in 1700, but the concept of hitting it was an attack on a string. And if you kept your finger down, the string would continue to vibrate. And Bob didn't really think about things that way. That was obviously a major, not a discovery, but it was a major application to electronic music. Because Bob listened to me, and this is another piece of the true story. He pulled out a pad of yellow paper, and he said, Herb, do me a favor. Go across the street at the hardware store and buy me a doorbell button, a doorbell button. And I said, sure. So I went across the street, went into a hardware store, and spent 35 cents for a button. In that half hour, by the time I went over there and came back, he had written a whole bunch of things down on a yellow pad. And he said, okay, I have it. He said, the next time you play a note, push this button. And what the button he had put in when he wired the button in was the attack. As soon as you hit that button, the sound was attacked. And he immediately discovered the idea of attack, decay, sustain, release. So the basic concept of ADSR, which was absolutely has to be now, we don't even think about it anymore because it's so obvious, but it is a very basic function. The other big important function that we had during that time, I'll say and then go away from that, was that Bob had contacted Vladimir Ussachevsky from Columbia University. And Vladimir said, well, you're developing new ways to make sound electronically. Don't put a keyboard on it. Make it something that people can work on. And he and I talked for, if it was 30 seconds, that would be it. I said, Bob, put a keyboard on it. I said, first of all, new music has had a great beginning at the beginning of the 20th century with a German composer who invented 12-tone music. Someone? Thank you, Arnold Schoenberg. And he invented 12-tone music. Now, the idea of 12-tone music is how you organize and harmonize and all kinds of things, but it was the beginning of new music. And I said to Bob, he did all this with a keyboard. And the keyboard is an important thing to have on the instrument because it gives you the opportunity of making change, keyboard related, and in the long run, it is going to be a big thing to have on the instrument. And I did say the obvious thing, you will sell more, which was an obvious thing to say. And I'll say only one thing about that, and then I'll get off. Bob and I, at that time, were not thinking commercially. The instrument was, to me, a new classical musical instrument. And truly, that is how I thought we were doing and what we were doing. And so that's a very important thing. I want to mention a little bit more. Once the business began, I went back to being a teacher. And during those years of the late 1960s, I would go back and forth between here in Ithaca and where I lived on Long Island to where Bob was, and I would commute back and forth and spend times with him. But what we kept talking about were the developments of the instrument and how it developed, and that's Bob's work. And he would come up with things and talk to me about them. But this was what he was doing. The biggest question that I had at that time, which became a difference between us, is that I had spent all my previous life as a school teacher, and I never stopped teaching school. And I will say that as I was walking down here, one of my Hofstra University students who is in the audience said hello to me, and I said hello. And I've always been a teacher, and I said, Bob, one of the things we should do is manufacture an instrument for educators. And my idea of that thing was really impractical. In reality, it was truly impractical. Yes, we needed to get electronic music into the schools. But at that point, I thought it should be in the way of making a relatively inexpensive synthesizer that could also record and allow tape recording to be done for overdubbing and building compositions. Because now remember, we're talking about 1964, 65. And at that point, we did not agree. There was not a passing between Bob and I. There never was a passing, but there was a disagreement at that. And in the long run, I will say one more thing that was just, first of all, I remained a good friend with Bob. In 1969, Bob had a concert at the Museum of Modern Art, one of the greatest museums in the world of contemporary art. And we played that evening, they gave a jazz concert of new music by the Moog synthesizer. And there were 4 Moog, big modular Moogs, and I had a quartet, and there was another quartet. And we had 2 different quartets playing an evening of new music, new jazz in a new location. And that, of course, was one of the biggest things that led to the development of where the Moog went. In fact, the Moog modular system that I was playing, that exact same system, which was completed only 2 days before the concert, right after the concert, it was sold to Keith Emerson. The same instrument.
And Herb, sorry to interrupt here. Am I right in saying that we've got the schematics of that instrument? There was some sort of preset on it to enable it to play live, right?
Yes, we did have a preset that I think Bob put on for me just so that I could get through that concert.
But if you think about
But-
presets on
yes.
digital synthesis, this is like the first preset. It's amazing. to
Really,
think.
a totally new idea. Yeah.
And Chris Swanson, I think, was the
Yes, thank you.
with the other jazz.
Yes, thank you for saying it was, because I couldn't remember. Chris Swanson, whose music was great, very far out, and very far out electronically, moving in new directions. My music was more old-fashioned. By that, I don't mean it was really old-fashioned. It was jazz quartet music, and I had a tremendous keyboard player playing on it, modular keyboard, sort of like an electronic organ at that age.
Before we move on, can I just ask you one question about that? You mentioned about the keyboard, which is fascinating, of course, because we have a Buchla synthesizer on stage, Susan Charney performing earlier, and of course, my understanding is Ussachevsky actually bought the Buchla systems for the Columbia Princeton studio, and they were keyboardless synthesizers. But Bob also had the ribbon controller. So could you tell us, where does the ribbon controller figure in all this?
Well, I can't answer where it configured, but I do remember when Bob did show a modular instrument using a ribbon controller, and the keyboard and ribbon controller. And the ribbon controller could be used for pitch changes, which was the most obvious thing, but it could also be used to change timbre and speed of repetitions of the sequence. Thank you. I don't think of the word, but it could change the speed of the sequence.
May I
Please,
add
Eliana,
something to that? Two quick things. When Bob talked about the history of the synthesizer in popular music, or the beginning of its use widely, he always played Chris Swanson's Pulaski Skyway. And so those of you who are interested might want to listen to that. I think Brian Kehew helped get that back as a CD. The other thing that I wanted to say is that Bob's interest in keyboardlessness continued. He was extremely interested in expressivity and having the musical instrument be essentially an extension of the player's body.
Of course.
So that there were no arbitrary limitations. And he always continued, I think, to see the keyboard as an arbitrary limitation. So that things like pressure-sensitive keys and ribbon controllers continued to be an interest of his throughout.
One of the last things that he continued to work for was pressure-sensitive keyboards, which was a problem, a manufacturing problem and a design problem, but he continued to work on that. And Bob always, right after we were together, always wanted to be working with a musician, a composer, a performer, or both. That was very important, had been in his mind, and it was what he always did. I want to very quickly say a few years going on from where we were. We were, by that time, building, and during the 1970s, we were building and developing new synthesizers. The first one, big one that came in was the Polymoog, which really was partially designed by a guy named David Luce. And this guy came in and became a Bob Moog affiliate. I mean, they both worked together. David Luce was a great designer. And I wanted to mention one thing, just I thought it would be of interest, and that's to mention one musical instrument that Dave Luce and I designed at the end of the 1970s and into 1981 and 82. And that was what Dave wanted to build was, he called it, we need to build a string machine. that we were not building string machines. And it was a competitive concept, because by that period, and I'm not going to mention names of instruments, but Japanese instruments from Italian instruments, they were beginning to build machines that did good string sounds. And what I kept saying to Dave Luce at that point is, we need a machine for the person who plays club dates. I'm afraid that's how I brought myself up through college, playing club dates, weddings, bar mitzvahs, with combos, but knowing that what I wanted to have in my hand was a keyboard that I could play with and then could become strings, and it could become things that were new and different. And we did work. I brought along some things that I just thought is of interest, and it can't be projected. But if you're interested, you can talk about it. We talked together, and Dave Luce wrote to the whole company, and at that point, the company had been bought by a large manufacturer buyer who bought musical instruments and tried to spread them around the world. The corporation was called Norlin, Norlin. They were in Chicago. And what they did was they bought a lot of musical instruments companies, and they tried spreading them widely, didn't care that much about what they were or what they could be. And yes, they did help bring the guitar world into popularity, and the synthesizer world into popularity. But at that point of time, Dave Luce and I were talking, and I said, we have to have an instrument that can be played by not just in concert and not just for recording, but by people who are out playing weddings and bar mitzvahs. Something that is a single keyboard instrument that can play strings and then can play electronic sounds and do various elements of electronics with the same instrument and be polyphonic. And the instrument that we talked about ended up as the instrument which is called give me the name, Opus 3. Thank you very much for that. Because I didn't want to call it the Opus 3. I wanted to call it the Strings, Organ, Brass, which means it's the SOB. And I went to Norlin and said, we have this great instrument, which I'd like to call the SOB. And the Norlin guys took one look at me and said, you can't do anything like that. You have to give it a nice name. And I actually came up with the name Opus 3. and so that was the last and only thing that really I developed. And I did work very, very much with Dave Luce and developing that new instrument, which in the long run has remained a very successful instrument. It would have been a bigger seller if it was the SOB. But it remained an instrument, and people still talk about it very positively. It's a very nice instrument to play, and I won't go into it. But I just that was what I wanted to add to this discussion today on Moog products.
I'm certain we'll circle back to bring you in again with some more stories. But let's move on to Steve now, because you worked with Bob for a long time. Could you tell us how you got to meet Bob? And
Yeah, I met Bob in 1989. Transferred from my second year of college to the University of North Carolina at Asheville, where he was teaching. I had been studying clarinet. I would, potentially to be a professional clarinetist. Had cold feet about that. So I was also into experimental music, and I recorded my own music. And there at that college, they had a recording department, and professor, Dr. Robert Moog, was teaching there. I was like, well, that's nuts. What a strange, and it was also in-state tuition for me too. So anyway, so when I first met him, I was kind of intimidated. He's a large man, and is very serious in an academic setting. And I had some classes with him. He taught classes on making sounds with synthesizers. We called it analog synthesis. He also taught classes about classic tape music techniques, splicing tape. And then we also had a small MIDI studio at the time, and we got into some digital synthesis techniques and things like that. And there was a small studio that I had access to. It was fun. And as I was his student over the years, I got to know him a little better, and he got to know me a little better. And I was kind of an oddball in that it was a very small department. And this is in the mountains of, Western North Carolina, small college, and we just got along, and.
I should put in that Bob always said that Steve was his favorite student.
Oh, shucks. Well, yeah, thanks. Shucks.
So were you getting a degree in some with a studio part of it, or electronics part of it?
Well, I ended up with a Bachelor of Science in music and recording arts. The department head, he let me kind of do independent study, and so I got, as a result, I got a wide range of study there. Anyway, so out of college, I was trying to make it as a musician in a small mountain town in North Carolina, with kind of an experimental music. There was no option to like make money doing it then, and so I actually he had chosen to make Big Briar into not just a consulting business, but a commercial thing. And he had designed an instrument called the Series 91 Theremins. This was around the time that it was discovered that Leon Theremin, who everybody assumed was dead, had been found in academic circles in the United States, that he was very much alive. And Bob got a chance to meet him in an event in Stanford, and there was a groundswelling of interest in the theremin again, and this was sort of his kind of like the beginning of his final chapter of his.
Theremin movie,
career,
of
yeah.
course, was made as well this time, right?
Yeah,
By
the
Steve Martin. Yeah.
He
Steve
met
Martin
him in
movie.
Bulls first.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think he was not only his favorite student, he also said he was the brightest student he
That's
ever
right.
had. And
Well, yeah, I don't know about
Steve
that.
started out working at Moog Music building theremins, and then he became the production manager for theremins. And then when I got there, we moved him into a marketing role. You did all right in that one. And then, but he kept learning, and now he's an amazing hardware engineer. And most of the successful products that we've been able to design in the last 10 years have had Steve's imprint on them. So it's amazing that, a music technology guy or whatever degree you got, we're able to parlay that into an amazing engineering mind. So
There's a bit of luck involved with that. It's sort of like watching Gary Newman yesterday talking about all these lucky things. You find yourself,
But Mike, how did you meet Bob? And tell us how that all started.
yeah, I met Bob and Ileana at the same time in May of 2002, and I guess I, through a mutual friend who is working for the company still right now on a part-time basis, but so we met, and I needed a job because the company I was working for had been sold, and I think through this mutual contact, we sort of discovered that I had a set of skills that sort of meshed nicely with Bob, not the least of which was I could figure out how to take a Guitar Center purchase order and go get some money, which we desperately needed. And so at that first meeting of interest would probably be, I think at some point, they were still wondering who I was, and so I don't know if it was Bob or you, Ileana, who asked me for my references, which I gave my whatever references I had, and so I said, this is May of 2002 is before anything that I knew of called Google, so I didn't honestly, was like, okay, you're Bob Moog, but give me your references, and so he gave me Emerson, Wakeman, and Herbie Hancock's phone number, which that Sunday night I called all three of them. Who's this guy, and they shared their experience with Bob with me, and from a musician's perspective, it's pretty interesting. But yeah, that was May. I was probably around the first week of May.
April, actually.
When we meet, because I started May 8th. I didn't know. Maybe it was just the very tail end of April. Yeah. And, we did. We sort of meshed, and Bob, I was able to stay focused on the engineering aspects of things, and I had a background in finance and sales and marketing, and had just enough of engineering. I'm a mechanical engineer from NC State. So I had enough engineering background that I was able to ask an occasional interesting question and challenge him on a few things. And then we worked very well together, and one thing led to another, and yeah, he left us way too soon, so yeah.
I'd like to add to that, at the same time that you were calling Bob's references, I was calling your references.
Oh,
And,
good.
And I was thinking, one of the titles for this panel was Collaborators. And we need all kinds of collaborators. And Bob very much needed the collaborator that Mike was, because Mike brought a set of skills that the company would not have survived without. And as a result of that, the company was not only able to survive, but to grow and to become the center of innovation even after Bob's death that it is. So I think Mike is a really important collaborator.
Yeah, because the story goes from the early days in Trumansburger that business was not his strongest suit. Let's put it like that.
Yeah, I always heard that too, but I kind of disagree with that. I
was
just don't think it was his favorite thing to do. I think he could have been a good businessman, actually. And he did something in the early 60s that kind of proved that point. He hired a publicist in New York City. I think he paid him him, I don't know, $25,000, and the idea was to make Moog sort of synonymous with the word synthesizer. And still today, I'm sure that many of you have seen, if you look in a New York Times crossword puzzle, 4-letter word for synthesizer. And
That was absolutely the case.
Yeah.
I remember that time very well and drastically. But I do remember it, yes. Right. Moog was the word for synthesizer.
So it's interesting, he hired a publicist to get the brand out there, as it were, and that was in the 1960s already. He was doing that.
Yeah.
So I often wondered, the things he did in New York were very well covered, like the MoMA show got reviewed in the New York Times.
Yes, it did.
So there was obviously somebody who was paying attention out there.
Yeah. I think he was a better businessman than he was given credit for. But yeah, losing them was a very difficult time for the company, and Steve will remember this really well, Ileana too. But we, so maybe like 4 or 6 months prior, we were still in this little tiny sort of Butler building down on the river in Nashville, and we needed more space because the business was starting to take off. And I think it was around maybe in February of that 2005, we signed this lease to move into this 10,000, which was huge, 10,000 square foot space for us. And we, agreed to all these kind of terms and stuff, and the guy was off renovating the space and what have you. And then it was like just a few months later that he got the brain tumor. And you can't schedule construction. So the week he passed away was the same week that we were due to move into the new space, and so he buried Bob on a Wednesday, and Thursday and Friday of that week, we moved into this new space, and I had no idea what we were going to do. I mean, we had this 5-year lease in this new space, and the founder and the principal engineer, the genius behind the whole company, is dead now, and here we go. So that was a pretty stressful week. But right before that happened in February, he had told me about this guy named Cyril Lance, and we had been looking for a successor that Bob could mentor in that time frame. And he told me about Cyril, and I was like, well, yeah, that's great, but we can't afford anybody, so that's good to know. Let's keep going. And then he told me about the brain tumor, and so like I called Cyril and I said, Bob's got a brain tumor. Can you come to work? And he said, when do you want? When? I said, can you be here tomorrow? And he said, well, I guess. And so Cyril came down, and Steve and I and Cyril began to work on what became the Little Fatty. Just shortly after that, that's probably in October of that year, and 11 months later, we shipped the first one, which was hugely important because the whole industry questioned whether or not we could build a synthesizer without Bob being around. And we sold, I think, maybe 50 or 60,000 of them since then. So we were able to do that.
And so the Voyager was already out at that point, is that right?
Yeah, by then it was. But that was the first project that when I came on board, he was trying to get the Voyager into production.
Maybe we should say what the Voyager is for everybody out here. But
Yeah, it's a successor to them. Well, not digitized, but it's a mini Moog that has presets.
Yeah.
Presets, okay.
Yeah.
And anyway, he was trying to get that into the market, into production, and had it pretty well designed. Still worked on it. You can probably tell them the story about the touch surface, but
I was going to say that would be a good one. Yeah.
that would be good.
Baking the touch
Yeah.
surfaces in the oven at home.
Tell us a bit about that then.
Go ahead, Steve.
Well, I think, Mike, you probably remember this better. What I remember, so the Mini Moog Voyager was a reimagining of the Mini Moog. So it was a monophonic synthesizer, but it was modernized. It had presets. We had a German engineer who helped us with the software side of things. His name was Rudy Linhart. He had also worked with Bob on a couple of other projects, including the Ethervox MIDI theremin. One of the features of this synthesizer was that it was it wasn't crowd-funded, but it was crowd-sourced in a way. He had gone out and solicited on the internet from various mailing lists ideas about what kind of ideas would you want to see in a modern Mini Moog. And he got all this feedback. And so the ultimate design of the Mini Moog Voyager was a tremendous number of people's input on things that they wanted, things that would be useful to them in a modern musical context. And one of the things that was prominent was a touch surface controller. It wasn't graphical, but just like everybody takes for granted now, you wiggle your finger on your iPad and you do this and that and the other. This was a touch controller for a synthesizer, three-dimensional, X, Y, and area, which is essentially pressure. This was originally to be this fiber optic controller made by some company in Canada that is no longer in business. And he had gotten samples, and the clock was ticking. And the technology to use that particular touch surface was a bit of a challenge at that time. We didn't actually couldn't probably really afford in that design the technology that would really get that to work well. So he had worked on a project much earlier, a non-musical project called the Peptic Tracer. Right? This is some kind of touch input controller, and part of it is it's a circuit board, and on the top is there's some copper electrodes, and then there's a resistive material printed on and baked on. And when you touch it, you're basically completing a circuit and loading down the circuit in a way that you can detect where your finger is on the surface. And so he knew about this. He probably didn't want to go there because he would have to bake it in his oven. to get it done. But so that is actually what ended up going into the product. This is the same. If there's, I'm not sure how much of the MTS keyboard materials are in the archive at this point, but this is the same principle behind the MTS keyboard, which is the multiply touch-sensitive keyboard. This is a project.
I'm not sure there are any materials. I mean, I may still have some. But.
Yeah, well, this would be an interesting thing. So there's a composer named John Eaton that Bob was collaborating with, and this was an early keyboard that was not just on-off, not just velocity sensitive, not just pressure sensitive, but had each key had a touch screen basically on it that you could wiggle. So each key had individual expression in 1, 2, 3, 4 axes, right? So that's still kind of the holy grail of keyboards. We're just starting to see technology that's affordable enough to realize something like that. But so he had some experience with this. Anyway.
Yeah. So that was the last sort of piece, and I know we were supposed to start shipping the Voyager like in the next week or two and whatever. And I was like, so where's this touch surface controller? It's got this big hole in the middle of our sheet metal and nothing to put in it. And he said, don't worry about it. I got it figured out. Don't worry about it. I'm like, okay, I'm really getting worried here. One weekend, he goes home and got this resistive paint that Steve's talking about, painted it. I think he baked it in your oven over the weekend and brought it in as the prototype, and it kind of worked. And what's really interesting, a couple of things, was that the factory where that touch surface printed circuit board actually got produced is the same exact factory that we're in today. Bob actually was in that factory with it. So we moved from like this Butler building to this other mill kind of building, but now we're in a 70,000 square foot facility down in the north side of downtown, Asheville. But that building, which has been there since the 30s, was, before it was abandoned and what have you, it was a printed circuit board facility, and Bob actually sat there and worked on this touch surface control device in that same building. So we say the spirit of Bob's around, it actually is around.
Kind of is.
I have a question for you, the people at Moog Music. So in the early days, it's clear Bob collaborated with musicians like Herb, with David Borden, with Wendy Carlos, Keith Emerson. So how does that work in the modern world of building synthesizers? Are there musicians that you guys are collaborating with? Is it the same thing?
Yeah, every day. I mean, that goes on. We're working on, we're working on 3 or 4 new products right now, but it doesn't matter if it's now or 2 years ago or 5 years ago. We still do a lot of that. And we have a group of musicians that we're very close with. Jason's here. He does a great job of managing that relationship for us. And yes, we're still getting those inputs in, and it's a really critical part of our design process.
The other thing I remember Bob telling me about in the story of the mini Moog was that many of the engineers, who I think Jim Scott is out here, also had good ears at listening, and that they could, tell what made good sound. And is that something you look for in engineers these days when you're hiring them? And
Well, we've got some people. Steve,
out of all recognition, so that doesn't matter. I don't know.
No. We still need ears, and we still listen to every single thing before it leaves the factory. We still, many people may not know this, but we have over 50 people that still build synthesizers every single day on that factory in Asheville, and quite a few of them, the Collaborators, Steve, but there are other people in the organization that have ears. And they're very, very important because you can have all the oscilloscopes and tuners you want, but ears are really what makes the difference. So, yeah.
I've recently gone down to the factory just to be there and walk through the factory and said hello. A lot of the people who work there say hello to me because they think I'm the guy who started the whole thing for them, but they are, I watch them work individually on whatever they're doing, and they're listening and working with their ears all the time. I see that all the time, and that it is, of course, absolutely beautiful and so important.
I think that one of the things that gets lost a lot of times in this world that we live in, where things come from China or someplace, is, that it takes a lot of effort, and people like Steve and Joe, who's also in the audience here, our marketing officer, chief marketing officer. It takes a lot of effort to come up with instruments that people are very interested in and want to buy. And we spend a lot of time really focused on the innovation side of the business and the research and development of new instruments and new ways of using the technology. And I think that gets lost a lot today. And I don't really know why.
And I'd like to add that I would say a majority of the people working there are musicians themselves.
So tell us a story as well about remanufacturing the modular Moog and the mini Moog, the original one. You did a custom, was it a limited run? Why did you do that? And tell us
the
about
modular, the legacy, we call it the legacy modular systems, started with the guy that was here yesterday, Brian Kehew. So Brian and one of the engineers that work at our place now, Gene Stopp, who's very familiar to a lot of people in the synthesizer world, had started collecting schematics and schematic diagrams for all the old modular things. And they actually had started purchasing what we all referred to as the unobtainiums, which were the specific transistors and switches and stuff that went on these modular things. And at one point, they got so far into it, and Brian, I think, realized that it doesn't make any sense for us to try to do this. We need to call Mike up and Moog Music up and see if there's a reason why you guys would be interested in doing that. So we're like, well, absolutely. It was just the timing was right for all that. So we got together with them. We spent 2 years, I think, going through the research phase on all that to make sure that we had all the schematics right and the design, and we could find those unobtainiums. And then we were able to produce the modular systems. We're still producing modular systems. We just came out with a vocoder. We're making a Model 10. I think we have a few of the 3Cs left still. So, yeah, we're making those. Steve may have add. You want to add anything to that?
Pretty much said it all. The Mini Moog was another interesting project in terms of reissuing it. The Voyager itself had become okay. So when you make electronic musical instruments, and you're making things with technology ages in terms of what's commercially available. And as Mike says, there becomes things that are unobtainium, which means they're obsolete. Right? You look in a catalog, you look online, and it says, "Oh, this part is obsolete." Okay. So things have lifetimes, right? So the Voyager had reached the end of its lifetime because there was enough stuff in it that was no longer made. It was getting to be kind of a pain to keep going. And we had pretty much filled the market demand for it at that point. But the Mini Moog was an interesting proposition because we had talked before Mike joined us even, Bob and I and our team had talked about doing a Mini Moog with MIDI. It was basically just a Mini Moog. And so it had been talked about and discussed, and it was great to see that discussion come to fruition in that particular project. And that was I was also challenged. So sometimes when you're there were a few things that we had to rework a little bit to
I have a strange and interesting story to put about the Mini Moog. 1970, I believe that's the right year. Yeah. And Bob had actually contacted me, and he said, "Herb, I know that we were not, we were not getting to be good friends anymore because of the music education thing." He said, "However, I'm going to send you 2 new instruments." And he sent me Mini Moog number 67 and Mini Moog number 94. And I kept them, and the biggest mistake I ever made was selling number 67, but that was not very, very long ago. It was only about 3 years ago. 94 I play all the time. To me, I think the Mini Moog is my favorite musical instrument. And just, I played the trumpet all my life, and I played piano all my life. I just love the instrument. Anyway, you were talking about it, and I do have one left of that first run of Mini Moogs.
Can I ask a question about Gary Newman talked yesterday about the role, beautifully, I thought, about the role of accidents in his musical composition. And I remember Jim Scott telling us about the accidents in the history of the Mini Moog. For instance, the power supply, one of the beautiful qualities of the Mini Moog is how the oscillators don't lock together. They sort of roll through each other, which produces this warm, breathing sound. So when you came to redesign, did you have to keep with the mistakes?
We did keep up with a lot of the mistakes. Yeah.
Yeah.
That was not a project to fix what was wrong. It was a project to recreate what was done.
I'm sorry, my Mini was rebuilt, corrected.
Yeah.
Both of them.
So yours doesn't roll through it locks?
Well, no.
Interesting, yeah. We should maybe throw this open to the wider audience to ask questions.
One of the, before you do that,
Yeah.
Trevor, one thing that people oftentimes ask about is during that time frame when Bob passed, and I'll give it just a quick story because I think a lot of people find this interesting, is in November of 2004, Bob and I used to go to lunch every Friday, and we would talk about the business or just talk about whatever. But in November of 2004, and keep in mind we'd been about 2.5 years into the business at that point, and I was having lunch with him, and once a month I would go over the books with him and say, how things were going financially and what have you, and that was this meeting. And I said to him, I remember we're sitting in a fish house, and I said to him, well, things are starting to look good. We've had 2 or 3 profitable months in a row. We've got a big backlog now. I think things are going to work out, because up to that point it was very touch and go, the whole thing. And he would do this every once in a while, but it was exaggerated this time. He used to have these pregnant pauses before he would answer you if it was something he wanted to really think about before he said anything. And this particular pregnant pause went on and on, like I would say for 3 minutes at least. To the point where I was like, oh, maybe he didn't hear me or whatever, but I was like, hey, we're doing it, And I remember he looks at me and he said, Mike, I couldn't be prouder. He said, I've never worked for a successful company, one that could take care of their employees and their families. And that really, to this day, really struck me that he knew that, 6 months later, he was fighting for his life, basically. But at that point in time, he knew that we were going to carry forward and the company was going to be successful in a way that would make him proud. And I think
I think everyone here probably knows that Moog Music is an incredible success, and many of us are playing those synthesizers you're producing now, and it's fantastic that this is happening. And of course, this is linked to a whole cultural change with the analog revival. Moog Fest, I think, has something to do with it as well. The use in electronic dance music. There's lots of things going on here that I think suddenly it's the moment for these sorts of instruments.
I think the roots of it, though, are a couple things. One of them is this collaboration that Bob does or did with artists that we seek to continue. But starting with Herb, and he continued that through his whole career. He was a great listener, and if you're doing an endeavor, if you're doing any kind of innovation, it's not what's up in here solely. It is also what people are. It's a dialogue, And so you have to be a great listener. And that was one of his greatest skills, honestly. The other root of that is that he, as a person, was a man of the people. I don't know how else to say it. He loved to give, and he was generous with his time. He was generous in ways that surprised people, I think. When he would be at a public event and people would come up to him and say, "Oh, Bob Moog, you know, I did this or that with this synthesizer that you made," and he never. I never saw him be ungracious about that. He took it in stride, and it was a good example for us, you know. So we're built on a foundation of something that he created. He laid the groundwork for. It's pretty humbling.
On that note, should we invite more comments, questions from the audience? It's over to you. Anyone like to ask a question about anything?
This is outside of the musical Bob Moog. I've worked on curating the exhibit, and one thing we didn't have space to exhibit was his work with the ACLU. And I wanted to just bring up the fact that we have these documents about his involvement with ACLU and freedom of speech, and it is sort of speaking to the way in which he was thinking about humanity, where we're thinking about him as this kind of technology tinkerer, but in fact he was incredibly engaged in freedom of speech rights. So I don't know if there's any stories that you have about his activity there.
Yeah, I'd like to respond to that. I'm glad you brought that out because I think that's an important side of him, and it's something he and I spent quite a bit of time talking about issues like that. He got a lot of that from his aunt Florence Moog, who was the first tenured woman professor at Washington University in St. Louis, and he admired her civic involvement and her willingness to stand up for causes, and I think he really modeled himself on her. He also had, I think that the only thing that he was very deeply ambivalent about, having to do with his inventions, was that music has always been a social event. It's always been something that has brought people together. The act of making music and the act of playing that music for an audience is something that created community. And he really was very concerned about the, I'm going to use the word degeneration. He did not use that, so it may not be appropriate, but the development of music into something that people do alone in a studio, and it's then listened to alone, and rather than bringing people together, it tends to move people apart. So I think he was always concerned about the forces that bring communities together and the forces that tear them apart.
Yeah, there, gentleman there.
Hi, thank you. Over the past couple of days, I've really enjoyed all this. And of course, talking about invention, it always occurs to me the old adage that necessity is the mother of invention. So in that vein, I guess I could leave it to Alana or whomever might chime in, but with the synthesizer and the progression that it's happened over the years, what was the necessity? Was it necessary? What's your philosophy on the necessity of this invention?
Are you asking me that?
Well, I thought perhaps knowing him best, perhaps you could answer that, or anybody that wants to
Anybody
chime
can
in on
answer
that.
that.
I think that it was in some sense maybe not necessary, but it followed a very logical progression from Bob's strong interest in working with his dad on electronic projects. His dad managed the very large repair and maintenance crew, 300 people for what Bob always referred to as the Edison Company, now Con Edison, and was an electrical engineer himself. And the fact that his mother strongly wanted him to be a performing artist, which he did not want to be. And his strong interest in making things. So in that sense, I suppose you could say, I mean, I happen to think that things are not necessary in the philosophical sense of predetermined, but I think it was an outcome of his own interests, and he was very well aware, because he was a real scholar of the history of electronic music, that there were other forces that had contributed to what was available, what was there for him to think about, that probably would have resulted in something very similar to that, in the same way that color television was invented by several different people, including Leon Theremin, at about the same time. So I guess that's the best I can do.
I can add a tiny bit to the necessity as mother of invention, and that is that ever since I was a little guy, I always wanted to build and invent and create new things. And I'm not going to go into it here now, but those I've talked to know that I designed and built an automobile while I was still in high school. And I've always loved building, and the necessity of when I met Bob, as soon as we met that wonderful June, the necessity of building this machine was part of my love of being involved in building. So that is.
Can I just throw in something here? As a sociologist of technology, I'm thinking that what's important is also what's happening in the wider culture and how that impacts the technology, and the technology impacts back on the culture. And so Bob was working at the same time as Don Buchler and other people, the EMS company. What was happening? Psychedelic music was developing, and there's no doubt about the association between the Moog synthesizer and the Buchler and so on, and what was happening in the wider culture, both shaping each other. So I think that's part of the story as well. And it's very interesting to reflect that new instruments, whole classes of instruments, very rarely get innovated. You have to go back a long way to an important new class of instruments like the synthesizer.
Yeah.
And so what happens, saxophone was invented by Adolph Sax, 1840, but it's taken up in jazz. You have a new music, Charlie Parker and so on in jazz, is leading to the success of the saxophone. And I think the wider culture, this is my own sociologist's take on it, is part of the role here.
So that is true for the whole history of music, absolutely.
Now we've got this gentleman here.
I was wondering, this relates to the sociology and the movement of technology. What did Bob think about all the software emulations and samplers, which I know you've, as a company, have put out some amazing iPad apps that have made the Moog sound accessible to a lot of people?
I would, if you don't mind, I can speak to that. Bob was technologically agnostic. He didn't care if it was an analog solution or a digital solution. To him, there was a place for everything. There's a place for different tools. Each of these solutions is a tool a musician's going to use to make music. And for some musicians working in a computer, that's a good solution for them. For other people, they need hardware to interact with, something it's a different experience. So, I think his overall thought was, as long as the interface is good and the sound is good, he didn't have a strong feeling of this is junk versus this is the better way. In fact, he used computer software to do various things too. So, but that being said, at the time that he was around, the technology of digital audio had not evolved to the level that it has now. So in his lifetime, he probably he didn't get to hear some of the things that we hear today, the quality of sound of some of the digital audio things we hear now. That doesn't mean it's more or less valid. They're just different tools for different users, essentially.
I'd like to add to that. I think, yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I remember a lengthy discussion he had with a friend of mine who became a friend of his, who collected early recordings of country music in the Appalachians in the 20s and 30s, and we were listening to some of this stuff, and he got into a long discussion with John about the fact that there's always a point at which newer technology sounds worse than the existing technology. They were talking about amplification at this point, which was new, which enabled recording of these groups way out in the country. And he said pretty well exactly what you said, that at that particular point, digital technology was not as good as analog technology, but he had no doubt that it would be. And he had no doubt that the technology that he had helped to develop would be superseded. But there is always this in-between time where the new stuff is not yet as good as the old.
Okay. Puck? Yeah.
On the kind of sociology of technology theme. Thinking about those things also myself, people do think about it in different ways. And in thinking about technology, big argument, a main argument people make is they say, well, look, there's no good technology or bad technology. It's how you use the technology. And so I have a question, probably know the answer, but it brought to mind the person he invented auto-tune, okay? And then a lot of people got upset about auto-tune, and it's like, they listen to a song and it's all auto-tuned up, and he found himself a little on the defensive, and he said, look, I just invented the car, okay? I didn't drive it off the road, okay? So, don't get mad at me about how people are using like this auto-tune. And I just wonder, from your experience with Bob and all the history, it seems like such a positive, symbiotic relationship all the time, and a great synthesis. Was there ever a time when he said, oh, I'm cringing. I just can't believe they used my instrument for that music. Like, I didn't build it for that. Did that ever occur?
He was pretty tactful. He wouldn't cringe so much, but I'm certain that he had some things. If you saw Brian Kehoe's talk yesterday, and he was showing the rather really crass commercial uses of the Moog synthesizer in the late '60s, these switched on albums that weren't switched on Bach, that were just opportunistically trying to cash in on this new sound. And as Brian pointed out, some of those records are terrible. And Bob was a great listener, not just of people's communication, but also of music. He picked up on that. But I think, again, he was in the same position. He had designed the car, and some people drove it off the road. In fact, I remember him talking about early on, there was quite a bit of controversy in some of the musical unions in New York City about the Moog synthesizer taking jobs away from orchestral musicians and that sort of thing. I don't know, Herbert, if you had any background with that, but there's sometimes backlash, just like people had backlash to hearing the auto-tune sound so much. But in this case, it was more sociological backlash. Here's a new instrument, and people are going to lose their jobs over this instrument because it can make a flute sound, or it can make a timpani sound. Well, that wasn't really the purpose of his invention. If people wanted to use it to do that, that was their choices. But there's sometimes this kind of backlash against these new technologies that seem threatening, because there is potential to misuse them. Yeah, so I don't know. Interesting thought.
I think the technology is not always value neutral in that way. I think anything has unintended consequences. Some of those unintended consequences are virtually impossible to avoid once the technology is there, and I'm sure we can think of social media as good examples of that. I think the thing that he would probably most deplore is what I mentioned before, that music currently can be used to increase social isolation rather than to decrease it.
Trevor, one thing that I think, there's still a few young people in the audience, but most of the folks in here have experienced this themselves. But I think one of the things that maybe gets lost in this whole thing is how transformational this instrument was and is for people that haven't had a chance to really listen to it. So I'll just give one quick example of this. So I think, Ileana, you were with me. We were at the Herbie Hancock concert. Yeah. Were you there? And we had these nice seats. You weren't there? We had these nice seats. Bob and I were right in the middle, and Herbie was there. And the night before, he had come by the office, and we'd given him a mini Moog Voyager. And we didn't really know what he was going to do with it. It was similar enough to the mini Moog that he was able to play it. So he was in this period of his creative life, Herbie was, where he was doing some really avant-garde jazz stuff, really pretty far out there. And so there's this massive group of people, 2,000 or 3,000 people listening to this sort of far-out jazz, a little bit hard to get into completely. And about 2/3 of the way through the concert, he stops and he says, I got this last night, haven't used it yet, but I'm going to bring it out and play a little bit. He went backstage, brought out the mini Moog that we'd given him the night before, put it on top of the piano, and this audience that literally 5 minutes ago was mostly a sleepy, sort of just sitting back in their seats and barely awake crowd, within 30 seconds, was up and dancing in the aisles. I mean, it was a group of transformational event that like nothing I've ever seen before. And so if you're a young person, you wonder what all the fuss is about this Moog synthesizer thing. That's what the fuss is. It's unbelievable if you put it in the right hands, played by the right people. It can really transform an audience.
I heard the same thing with I want to say his name. I'm sorry, I'm going through a short. Herbie Hancock and Chick Corea.
Chick Corea.
That's it. And I remember when Chick came into the plant in Buffalo, when we were still in Buffalo. And right after that, he did a concert in Buffalo and played the mini Moog. And it was just a period of time that I was absolutely thrilled me because he was saying new things with new things by a jazz composer who always wanted to invent new things. And he had that instrument which gave him the reach of it. And he was literally performing the night that he picked up the mini Moog at a concert.
We can take, I think we've got time for one. The gentleman here, I know you had your hand up. We can take one more question, and then we're probably going to have to wrap up.
Yeah, I was a Cornell electrical engineer 40 years ago, and I took my clarinet apart, to your point, 40 years ago and put switches in it and tried to electrify it as a wind player. And I still play, I got an AE10 Roland AE10 now, and I never learned to play a keyboard. We bought one of those organs at the mall and everything. I never learned to do it. But the bottom line is, when I show my community band with my AE10 and I plug it in instead of in my real saxophone, when we reach a point where people are going to accept these alternate instruments, wind instruments, rather than a keyboard, it seems like they've accepted it. But it seems like in those kind of instruments, it's got to be the real instrument, or you're not playing. And do you think that'll ever change?
You've already talked about that. The development and growth of wind instruments is historically through the growth of what we refer to badly really as Western music, but the clarinet and then the saxophone and all of these instruments were developed into the field for different reasons and ended up in different places in the field. I don't know if that...
Well, but today, like, if I could be a synthesizer, I could go to Vestal Band, I play the synthesizer, I put in synthesizer mode or cello mode or whatever mode, and there's a lot of complexity to learn to control that properly, to get the pizzicato, vibrato, and all those things. And I'm just saying, eventually, you could allow groups to have those kind of players to sit right next to a real cello or a real, you know what I'm saying? Will there ever be hybrid groups like that? I mean, the synthesizer certainly has a role in that. that's sort of like, I don't see that ever happening. Like, the traditionalists still learn to play the best saxophone, play the best clarinet.
Well, what you're saying really is there's a question that we all really don't need the answer to, is that is, are synthesizers really replacing traditional classical instruments? And classical, I'm just using a broad term. But
Do you mean as a controller? You want people to accept a electronic clarinet? Or,
Wind instruments that
Sure.
are more like a synthesizer.
yes.
Wind control synthesizer.
Yeah. I don't know. Steve's probably more up this. I feel like there are people out there that are doing some really interesting things with wind instruments.
Yeah.
There was that throat thing, wasn't there? People you
yes, yes.
There's the guy now, Steiner, who his son is now doing an updated version of his Synthicon, which is an electronic wind instrument, and that's quite. Yeah.
A long time ago with the DX7.
Sure. Yeah. It's been around.
They've been out there, just haven't been accepted.
Yeah. I think a lot of music making is wild
All of
and
these-
crazy as it seems, is fairly conservative in nature.
Absolutely, I agree with that. It's amazingly conservative as
Yeah.
a field to study.
Yeah.
That's why making a breakthrough is so hard, I think. So I think we have to wrap up here because we're going to have a break. I think I've got that right before we come back for Susie Analog.
Yes.
3:30. And I'd just like to, what's up? Yeah. Is you,
Just two quick questions. Is there a relationship between the museum and the firm? And what do people do? They're intertwined questions, really. If you have an instrument that needs restoration or repair, does that go? Do you have a facility for dealing with that? Does it? What's the relationship between that and the museum? Very quickly.
No, we don't have a repair facility for fixing old instruments. That's your second question. The relationship between the museum and the company is one that we'd like to make closer over time. So it hasn't gelled like we would like to see it over time.
That's the Moog Foundation versus Moog Music.
Right.
okay, well, I'd like to join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you for your questions, and we'll see you back here